to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where Amy Edmonds from Wyoming Liberty Group has been patiently standing or sitting by. I'm going to go with the sitting position on this one. What do you think?
You would be correct.
I would be correct. A 50-50 chance. I got that one right. And Amy is, of course, focusing on education. And I got a chance to, because you sent it to me, listen to your podcast. So before we get into this, where can people find your podcast? Because I think that's interesting information, and it's really sounding pretty good when you do these things.
We post them both on our full site and then on our sister site, which is the education site. So you can go to wyliberty.org, go to our podcast video section, or you can go to the education side, which is wylibertyineducation.org. Either one of them will get you to the podcast.
Okay, now this time, rather than just talking about the usual things we talk about, Common Core and budgeting and things like that, you went off into the area of what sounded to me like talking about the diversity of education that's necessary. I'm not even going to say for kids, but for adults as well. And it sounded to me like you were targeting the government as being non-diverse in their education. Did I have that right? Did I read it right?
I think you're getting there, Glenn. That's
okay.
Exactly. Yeah. We're looking at a new project here at the Liberty Group this year on education. It's not necessarily new. It's just the idea, if we want to look at education policy with clear eyes and really start talking about what does it take to educate a whole child, what does a good education look like, and are we getting those in our public schools?
Okay, see, because to me, first off, I noticed when I was young, I thought, it's not necessarily if you're smart, it's how you're smart. But it's also that you know how to continue to learn throughout your entire life. So just learning, memorizing something and regurgitating, I think by now we all know is not a good way to teach anybody because you don't know how to apply the knowledge. So how should we be learning then?
Well, I think this is the question that we wanted to pose to people. What does a real education, a whole education look like, and where are we going? There's a lot of discussion, and has been a lot of discussion in this country about sort of this specialization that has happened, particularly in our higher education schools with research universities that started at the turn of the century and onward. And what does that actually do to education? Why have we slowly been going over to this idea of specialization? And we see this even more so. America is just doubling down on this effort to, have, quote, college and career-ready students, as though this is the ultimate goal of an education. And, what a lot of people are saying, and what we are saying here at the Wyoming Liberty Group, is an education is not so that you have a career at the end of it. An education is so you have a life worth living, not just a living. You don't just make a living off of your education. Really, you are there to educate a whole human being, to make you a person who can create a life that is worth living. And we want to talk about that. It's a bigger concept, and we know that, but we think it's important to discuss that because so many parents that we talk to, Glenn, really bring this up. They don't want their child just to be a widget maker.
Well, these days, you can't necessarily just be a widget maker if you think about it, because throughout somebody's life, they're going to move several times. Gone are the days where wherever you were born, you lived within, let's say, sight, if not 5 miles of where your parents were, and you did the same thing your whole life. People tend to move around a lot and change careers.
That's right. That's exactly right. We know that. And so we started the conversation. So some of my podcasts in the last week or two have really been about what does it take to educate a whole child, looking at education policy through different eyes than just, we oftentimes get very focused on policy. And you and I have done this. We talk a lot about just policy, but these policies affect people. And how does it affect their life? And what does it mean? And in education, the stakes are high, Glenn. The stakes are very high because your education stays with you your whole life. And so we wanted to explore this question. We're going to look more into the idea of, this country was founded on a solid liberal arts education. We are now so obsessed with specific subject matter in the public schools, math, English, science, because these are the subjects that are tested. What about, the arts? What about music? What about these other areas that provide for the full gamut of what it means to be a human being? Why are we neglecting those over this obsession with certain things? The bottom line is all of this is being driven by artificial constructs from government.
Right. A couple of things that I would like to see. First off, let's get rid of the courses in underwater basket weaving. There's nothing you can do with that. I mean, that's just, well, there's all sorts of courses that they have people take, which I don't see what it has to do with anything or how someone ever talked a university into picking up those courses in the first place. But I would also love to see courses that specifically teach people how to connect the dots. Okay, you have all of this information. What can you do with it?
Well, yes, I mean that's right. I mean, how do you make a whole life? How do you become a lifelong learner and then go from there? You know, there are lots of concerns over the lack of entrepreneurship that's coming out of the United States, and this is a trend that people aren't thinking as broadly as they used to, that we used to be this country that really was very entrepreneurial, and we aren't anymore. And it is about connecting those dots and thinking outside the box. We all love to talk about, you know, some of the big people we know, the Bill Gates of the world, and, you know, the Steve Jobs and Apple, and how most of those folks really didn't have a traditional public school education, and they didn't go on to higher because they were able to think outside of the box. And we want to look at all of that and talk about, you know, the rigidness of where public education is going, I think, is truly going in the wrong direction for what creates the right whole human being and what creates a country that can stand economically with the world.
Okay, see, but now you're getting into some very dangerous and seditious territory here because, Amy, it sounds to me like, first off, you're advocating for individualism. You're advocating for people to, I mean, think differently and not be part of the same old crowd, but maybe to go their own way. And I just don't know if that's acceptable anymore.
Well, sadly, you're right. I mean, you know, what is the quote? A free country is a country where you're free to be different. And, you know, you're absolutely right. Sadly, this country is getting more and more to the place where it isn't safe to be different. In public education, it certainly is not safe to be different. And that's getting worse and worse, and parents are really feeling the pressure. So, you know, what do we do about this? What do we talk about? And I finished a piece that should be up next week talking about why do we go on and on about school choice and why is this so critical? And we can talk about it. I can quote all kinds of figures to you about, you know, economic savings to taxpayers, increased graduation rates, why school choice and school vouchers and all these programs, what they've done and why they're good. But really the bottom line for school choice is this: parents are trapped in systems they don't want to be in. They want out. That should be the number one thing that motivates policymakers. Beyond all of the other arguments, we hear at a think tank, we like to make big fancy arguments, and they're good arguments, and we certainly should make them. But the reality is, people should not be trapped in a system that is not listening to them and is not meeting their needs, particularly when they're paying for it.
Right now, at this point, you're talking about what? School vouchers? Would that be part of it?
Yeah, right. School choice of any kind, opportunity scholarships, vouchers, however you want to call it, but the ability for parents to take their funds and move them wherever they want their child to learn.
Okay. Now, part of what I was saying, teaching people how to think, let me tell you about one of the prouder moments in my life. I've always been this way. I walked into a radio station I was working at. I walked into their conference room. I turned around and noticed that one of the walls was painted blue. And I went, hey, you know what I can do with that? And I went and I got a camera. I bought a camera. And then I bought a program that allowed me to do the same kind of green screen or blue screen effects that you see on the evening news or in Hollywood movies. And from there, I had turned within a weekend, their conference room, anytime I wanted to bring my equipment in, which wasn't much, into a television studio. Because I was able to work with what's around me. You know, just take a look at what was available to me and start connecting the dots and putting together new ideas. When I look at kids graduating school today, I look at that kind of divergent thinking as lost. Again, you're supposed to do it the way that you were told to do it. So where do you go to learn that? Because homeschoolers I know do very well at something like this. But what kind of schools, let's say around Wyoming, are teaching that kind of divergent thinking?
Well, a classic liberal arts college or even a K through 12, a private school. Right now, most parents, the only choice, Glenn, for them is either to find a solid homeschool curriculum and school their children that way, or to find a private school. And you're right, they're very few and far between. here in Wyoming. We've seen more. We've seen a few pop up over the last year or two because of the concerns in public schools over Common Core and other government schemes. But there aren't that many because there simply isn't the demand yet because parents can't leave the public schools. They're sort of trapped. But really seeking out a solid liberal arts education for their children could be one of the best starting points. And I hate to prescribe exactly that because while I'm a huge fan of that, Glenn, I'll tell you that there could be parents listening right now that are saying, hey, that's not for my kid. And that's the point of school choice. Is that while I think liberal arts is really one of the most solid ways to go, there's nothing wrong with kids who learn differently and want a STEM career or are looking for that vocational tech career. The point is, parents need to be able to have that option.
Okay. Now, with parents having that kind of an option, right now we're dealing with people who just love the federal money that's pouring into states all across, which, by the way, that money's not going to be there forever. At some point, you're going to set up these great programs, these big programs, and the money's going to dry up because the federal government's going to go broke. But they're hooked on this government money. The problem is if you take the government money, you got to do it the government's way. Do you find more of that in Cheyenne at the Capitol or less of that these days?
No, I think definitely more. I mean, that this is the problem. The federal government is, it's another blog that I did, I think, a week or two ago talking about the issue of that, the very idea of federal money in private schools. And why that's a problem. I mean, we see it at the state level, we see it certainly at the government level, but it's seeping even into our private organizations. And so I talked about portability, which is this discussion we're having in the U.S. Congress on Title I funds, these federal funds that go to public schools for our most minority and disadvantaged students. And what's happened, we've had portability, the ability to move those funds from the public school to the private school. That's been going on since the 60s. But, there needs to be a refreshed argument about why this is not a good idea, because you're exactly right, Glenn. What happens are schools get addicted. And then when they should be a natural ally in the fight for choice, they suddenly become silent because they don't want to lose those federal funds. And while I can be sympathetic to the argument about equality and equity, that, geez, if we're going to educate at-risk children in our private school, then we should get the federal money. I understand the argument. I totally, to the fiber of my being, disagree with it. If you have a private school, and I discuss in my podcast, and this is something that's different from what you normally hear from me because it's something we're trying to talk more about, this idea of charity. When you start a private school or when you're in a private institution where you are either bound because of religious ideology to provide charity to the poor, that's what you should do. Asking government to give you money to provide charity is not charity.
Right. That's not. No, the money was taken from somebody by force.
That's exactly right. And so we need to be very clear here that if you're running a private school and you are, wanting to provide charity, then do that, provide charity. And we should all, it benefits all of us to reach out to the most disadvantaged in our community. And we lose collectively as a country, as a state, and a community when we look more and more to government to fill that hole because we're not willing to do it ourselves. Ultimately, we're doing it, Glenn, because we're paying the tax.
Yeah, we are. Okay, so let's talk real quick. Homeschooling. I came across an article. It was out of New Jersey. We all knew this was coming sooner or later. That some local New Jersey government, well, in fact, even the state of New Jersey, wants to get its claws into homeschooling. If you're going to homeschool, you're going to have to teach the following things in the following ways and give the following tests, or we're not going to let you homeschool. How's the state of Wyoming doing in that?
So far, so good. We haven't seen, there really hasn't been any legislation that we've seen or any major push to try to change it. Of course, I say that cautiously, Glenn, because while you get these news stories of just, obvious abuse, government abuse, where they're trying to step in and demand, the reality is the trend to monopolize the public education has spillover effects for everyone, including homeschooling, because when they're calibrating the ACT and the SAT and how students enter into colleges and land-grant universities all over the country, that affects even homeschooling. So I want to be careful about saying, it's true that Wyoming hasn't done anything overtly offensive against homeschooling right now, but this trend long term in public education will not help homeschooling.
Okay, now when you talk about diversity in education and more of a liberal arts, where we got to be careful because different people think in different ways. I mean, I've always been more of a divergent thinker, and I'm dyslexic, so that gave me certain advantages and challenges at the same time. There are some people who are very good at absorbing information, but not very good at connecting the dots. I mean, there's all sorts of different kinds of thinkers out there. There's engineers, for example. So we got to then, if we're going to do it your way, which I think is the best way to go because so many kids are so different, learn to identify what type of kid you have. How do you do that?
Well, I mean, parents, there's obviously there's lots of early detection, more so now than I am sure, Glenn, and you have a personal story than when you were young. We see this happening a lot more, that very quickly parents realize that there's something going on and they can go and get testing and recognize that their child is a different learner. So that's becoming more and more common, and we see it both in public schools and elsewhere. Public schools, obviously, because they educate the bulk of our students, are better at identifying that right now. But yes, certainly knowing how your child learns is pretty critical, and I'm sure your story is different because things have changed in the last 15 or 20 years.
Oh, they didn't know a whole lot about dyslexia when I was going through it in school, so I just basically had to struggle on through. But there's a lot more help today, and
there is.
If you're going to do this kind of a diverse education, people need to understand that there's a lot of help out there for their kid, no matter how their kid thinks, and here's the thing, they need to know how to find that help.
Well, they do, and the reality is, Glenn, that a system that is pushing more and more towards uniformity and conformity is not a good system for exactly what you're talking about, children with different needs. As a matter of fact, it's one of the reasons why nationally in the school choice movement, both the voucher program and scholarship programs and opportunity scholarship programs, almost all of those have begun with the focus on special education, special learning students, because there's such a demand in that area for parents to have more choices than the public school system. So exactly these reasons, that's why we've seen this explosion in school choice. Okay,
it's a new path for you. Once again, where do people find the information that you're putting out as you head down this new trail?
WYLibertyInEducation.org, or just our regular website, WYLibertyInEducation, WYLiberty.org.
Okay, thanks for coming on, Amy. Good to talk to you
again.
Thanks,
Glenn.